In today's episode, we explore the life of a seemingly ordinary high school teacher who gets caught up in a complex situation filled with hidden motives, obsession, and murder. It's a story about how a covert romantic relationship with a student ended in tragedy. Carter Dressler, 29, was a respected history teacher at Richmond High School in Richmond, Virginia. Known as Mr. Dressler to his students, he was easily recognizable by his neatly pressed suits and distinctive patterned ties, which gave a bit of flair to his otherwise serious appearance. Carter was often seen as quiet and reserved. Carter wasn't one to seek the spotlight or speak out of turn, but those close to him saw him as kind and considerate. His passion for history, especially American history, drove him to share that enthusiasm with his students. He frequently hosted overnight study sessions at his small one-bedroom apartment to provide extra learning opportunities. However, this practice raised concerns among neighbors who worried it might suggest inappropriate relationships with his students. Carter took immense pride in his garden, which featured a collection of rare and exotic plants he had nurtured over the years. One standout was the monk's wood, a striking plant with deep purple flowers known for its dangerous properties. Carter devoted several hours each day to caring for his garden, meticulously tending to each plant. Carter took special pride in the monk's wood, a plant he had grown from seeds purchased from a specialized nursery. Despite the rumors about his relationships with students, he was well regarded by both his students and colleagues. His lessons were lively and engaging, often blending historical events with current affairs to make history come alive. In the days before his death, Carter's routine remained unchanged. He continued teaching, tending his garden, and spending his evenings reading or watching PBS NewsHour. Yet, beneath the surface, there were subtle signs of tension in his personal life that went largely unnoticed. Some neighbors had noticed Carter walking late at night with one of his students but dismissed it as part of his mentoring. No one could have predicted that, just days later, Carter would become the victim of a shocking and sinister plot. On the evening of July 15, 2017, Richmond, Virginia, was experiencing a typical summer night, with the sun setting late and temperatures around 80 degrees. Carter Dressler's neighborhood was calm, with most residents winding down after a hot day. Around 7:30 p.m., Lisa Hall, Carter's next-door neighbor, decided to check on him. In her late 30s, Lisa was a single mother known for her outspoken and somewhat nosy nature, but she genuinely cared about her neighbors, especially Carter, whom she considered a close friend. Lisa had observed that Carter hadn't been out in his garden all day, which was unusual. He was typically outside by early morning, especially on weekends. As she walked across her lawn to check on him, a sense of unease grew, making her feel that something was amiss. She knocked on Carter's front door but received no response, and the house felt unusually quiet. Growing more concerned, Lisa decided to check the backyard, where Carter frequently spent his evenings reading or working in the garden. As she rounded the corner of the house, Lisa saw Carter seated in his favorite porch chair with a book in his lap and a cup of tea on the small table beside him. However, something was wrong. Carter wasn't moving. His head was slumped forward, and the book he cherished had fallen from his hands. Lisa's heart pounded as she called out to him. When he didn't respond, she gently shook his shoulder, only to find his skin cold and stiff. Panic overtook her as she realized something was terribly wrong. Lisa ran back to her house and called 911, her voice trembling as she described the situation. The dispatcher urged her to stay calm and wait for the authorities to arrive. Lisa stood on her porch, staring at Carter's lifeless body as she waited for the police. It was hard to believe that just the day before, she had seen him in his garden, smiling and waving as she drove by. Now he was dead, and she was the one who had discovered him. The first officers arrived within minutes, quickly securing the scene and confirming Lisa's worst fears: Carter Dressler was dead. The once peaceful evening quickly became a nightmare as flashing police lights and murmurs from concerned neighbors filled the quiet neighborhood. On July 15, 2017, the police arrived at Carter Dressler's home shortly after Lisa Hall's frantic 911 call. The first officers on the scene were Richmond police detectives Laura Cawley and Tom Keller. Detective Laura Cawley, a seasoned investigator in her mid-40s known for her sharp intuition and meticulous attention to detail, was accompanied by her trusted partner, Detective Tom Keller. Keller, slightly younger and more methodical, complemented Cawley's approach. Although they had handled many cases in Richmond, something about this one felt distinct from the moment they arrived at the scene. As they reached the back porch where Carter's body was found, Cawley was struck by the eerie stillness of the scene. The garden, usually vibrant and full of life, appeared almost haunting in the dimming light. The air, heavy with the scent of flowers, offered little comfort against the unsettling presence of death. Carter's body was unnervingly still in his chair, his head slumped forward and eyes closed, as if he had merely fallen asleep while reading. The detectives carefully examined the scene, taking note of the details. The book resting in Carter's lap was a history text, one of his favorite, open to a chapter on the American Revolution. Next to him on the small table was a cup of tea, now cold. Cawley examined the cup closely and noticed faint remnants of a powdery substance at the bottom. This discovery was an immediate red flag, indicating that something may have been added to the tea. The crime scene was surprisingly orderly, showing no signs of a struggle. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, and nothing to suggest a violent altercation. This led the detectives to suspect that Carter's death might not have been accidental. Cawley and Keller knew Carter was a reserved yet well-liked teacher, making it difficult to believe anyone would want to harm him. However, they also understood that the quietest lives can sometimes conceal the darkest secrets. They called in the forensic team, who promptly began their work, dusting for fingerprints and collecting samples. The team collected the teacup and its contents as evidence, along with some leaves from the monkshood plant in the garden, which Cawley suspected might be poisonous. They also examined Carter's body, noting his pale skin, bluish lips, and the stiffness indicating he had been dead for several hours. As the investigation stretched into the night, Cawley and Keller started to piece together the details of what had occurred. The absence of visible wounds and the presence of the poisonous plant led the detectives to suspect that Carter's death was the result of foul play, likely orchestrated by someone who knew him well and planned the murder carefully. With this in mind, they prepared to question those closest to Carter, beginning with his neighbors and the students who frequently visited his home. The first person they questioned in connection with Carter Dressler's death was Dan White, an 18-year-old student at Richmond High School. Dan was known for his charm and intelligence, frequently impressing teachers and classmates with his sharp wit. A standout member of the school debate team, he often led them to victories in competitions throughout Virginia. However, those who knew him well were aware that Dan had a darker side. Dan was known for being highly possessive in his relationships, with rumors suggesting an interest in violent sex and a tendency to be obsessive and controlling. Detectives Laura Cawley and Tom Keller brought him in for questioning the morning after Carter's body was discovered. They met him in a small, windowless interrogation room at the Richmond Police Department. Dan arrived appearing calm and almost indifferent, dressed in a neatly pressed polo shirt and jeans. His demeanor was relaxed, giving the impression that he had nothing to hide. Cawley began the interrogation by asking Dan about his relationship with Carter, describing him as a mentor who had supported him through many challenges. He explained that they often spent time together outside of school, discussing history and preparing for debate competitions. Dan spoke warmly of Carter, portraying him as a supportive, almost fatherly figure in his life. But as the questioning continued, Cawley shifted the focus to Dan's whereabouts on the night of Carter's death. Dan claimed he had been home all evening, working on a new debate strategy for an upcoming tournament. He said he hadn't seen Carter for a few days and was shocked to hear about his death. Cawley observed a slight shift in Dan's demeanor when she inquired about Carter's other students, especially those who also visited his one-bedroom apartment for overnight study sessions. His responses became more clipped, and his previously relaxed posture tensed. The detectives pressed him on his feelings toward Carter, subtly suggesting that jealousy might be a factor. Dan's responses grew increasingly defensive, and at one point he raised his voice, vehemently denying any involvement in Carter's death. Keller, noting Dan's shift from calm to agitated, saw this as a possible indication of deceit. When asked directly if he had ever felt jealous of Carter's close relationships with other students, Dan hesitated before firmly saying no. The hesitation didn't go unnoticed. Cawley and Keller exchanged a glance, recognizing that they had touched a nerve. Despite his outward calm, Dan's reaction indicated there might be more to his relationship with Carter than he was willing to reveal. As the interrogation concluded, Dan continued to assert his innocence, but the detectives left the room with more questions than answers. They recognized that Dan's charm and intelligence made him a skilled manipulator, and his relationship with Carter seemed more complex than he had revealed. The possibility that Dan's obsession with Carter might have turned deadly could not be dismissed. The police then turned their attention to Lisa Hall, Carter Dressler's 38-year-old neighbor. Known in the Richmond neighborhood for her outspoken nature and fiery temper, Lisa lived alone with her teenage daughter, Corona. She had earned a reputation for being very involved in other people's affairs. Despite her reputation, Lisa had a genuine fondness for Carter. They had been close friends for years, often chatting over the fence that separated their yards. She admired Carter's dedication to teaching and his passion for gardening, but she had long harbored suspicions about his relationships with male students. Detectives Laura Cawley and Tom Keller invited Lisa to the station for questioning. When she arrived, she appeared nervous yet composed, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans. Cawley started the interview by asking Lisa about her friendship with Carter. Lisa spoke warmly about Carter, noting their frequent exchanges of gardening tips and discussions about the latest news from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. However, her tone shifted when the conversation turned to Carter's relationships with his students. She admitted that she had been concerned about Carter's behavior, particularly his practice of inviting students to his small one-bedroom apartment for overnight stays. Lisa admitted that she had confronted Carter multiple times about his troubling relationships with students. She believed he might be seeking their approval in unhealthy ways, potentially even offering them sexual favors, though she stopped short of accusing him of assault. Her main concern was that Carter might be emotionally manipulating the boys to fulfill his own need for affection, and she had repeatedly urged him to stop. Despite her warnings, Carter continued his troubling relationships with students, which only deepened Lisa's frustration. When Cawley asked Lisa where she was on the night of Carter's death, Lisa said she had been home with her daughter, watching a rerun of NCI's New Orleans. She noted that she had seen Carter earlier in the day, but their interaction had been brief. Lisa didn't notice anything unusual during their brief interaction, but admitted she had felt uneasy for weeks, sensing something was wrong between Carter and Dan White, one of his closest students. As the questioning progressed, Lisa's emotions surfaced. She became visibly upset, with tears welling in her eyes as she spoke about Carter's death. Lisa insisted that, despite her concerns, she never wished harm on Carter and was heartbroken over his murder. Her genuine emotions struck the detectives, but they remained focused, searching for any signs that she might have been more involved than she was admitting. By the end of the interrogation, Lisa's alibi appeared solid, but her intense concern over Carter's relationships remained a point of interest. Cawley and Keller left the interview with a better understanding of Lisa's frustrations and her complex feelings toward Carter. Despite her distress, the detectives had to consider the possibility that Lisa's concerns might have escalated into something more dangerous. On July 20th, 2017, 5 days after Carter Dressler's body was discovered, the Richmond Police Department received a crucial piece of new evidence that would shift the direction of the investigation. On a hot, humid afternoon with temperatures climbing into the mid-90s, Detective Laura Cawley was at her desk, reviewing notes from previous interviews. A forensic technician, Mike Harris, entered the office with a serious expression and handed her a report. "You're going to want to see this," Mike Harris said. The report detailed the toxicology results from the tea found at Carter's home. The tests confirmed that the tea had been laced with aconite, a rare and highly toxic plant also known as monk's hood, which had been growing in Carter's garden. Aconite is notoriously difficult to detect, and its effects can easily be mistaken for natural causes unless specifically tested for. Cawley immediately called her partner, Tom Keller, and they reviewed the findings together. The presence of aconite confirmed their suspicions that Carter's death was indeed the result of foul play. More importantly, the presence of aconite indicated that the perpetrator had knowledge of plants and access to Carter's garden. This led the detectives to re-examine their list of suspects, particularly those who had been close to Carter and might have known about the deadly properties of aconite. The detectives decided to search Carter's home again, this time with a more targeted approach. They carefully searched through Carter's belongings, looking for any evidence of tampering with his garden or food. During their search, they found a small locked box hidden in Carter's bedroom closet. Inside, they discovered a collection of sexually explicit letters and notes from his students, with the majority coming from Dan White. The letters were graphic and intensely personal, revealing a secret consensual sexual relationship between Carter and Dan that had become increasingly strained in recent weeks. The tone of the letters indicated that Dan had grown more possessive and jealous, often expressing anger and frustration over Carter's potential relationships with other boys. One letter, in particular, stood out. One letter, dated just a few days before Carter's death, hinted at a potential outburst. Dan wrote about feeling abandoned and betrayed, saying, "If you're going to be with some other hot young thing, I don't want you alive." This discovery shifted the investigation's focus sharply back to Dan White. The new evidence not only confirmed a motive but also placed Dan at the center of the investigation. Cawley and Keller knew they needed to bring Dan back in for questioning, this time armed with the new findings. The stage was set for a final confrontation, and the detectives were determined to uncover the truth. With the new evidence pointing strongly toward Dan White, the detectives decided to investigate one final suspect, Officer Charlie Brennan, a 47-year-old Richmond police officer. Brennan lived across the street from Carter Dressler and was initially in charge of the investigation before being removed due to his personal connection to the victim. Known for his no-nonsense attitude and strong sense of justice, Brennan's secret sexual relationship with Carter now made him a person of interest. Detectives Laura Cawley and Tom Keller approached Brennan cautiously. Given his position in the police force, they knew they needed to be careful. They requested to speak with Brennan at his home, a modest brick house on a quiet, tree-lined street. When the detectives arrived at Brennan's house, he greeted them with a calm, almost guarded expression, knowing that the investigation was now focusing on him. The detectives started by asking about his relationship with Carter. Brennan confessed that they had grown close over time, initially connecting through their mutual love of history. Brennan explained that what started as casual chats about Civil War battles and Richmond's history eventually led to secret, intimate encounters. He spoke about Carter with a blend of affection and remorse, admitting that they had to keep their relationship hidden because of the scandal it could cause. When Cawley asked if he had ever suspected anyone of wanting to hurt Carter, Brennan hesitated. Brennan admitted that he had long been concerned about Carter's involvement with his male students, especially after Carter had suggested sharing some of his boy bank with him. Brennan had also noticed Dan White's growing possessiveness and had warned Carter to be careful. His protective feelings toward Carter were evident as he confessed that in the weeks before Carter's death, he had grown increasingly suspicious of Dan's intentions. Cawley and Keller then asked Brennan about his whereabouts on the night of Carter's murder. Brennan explained that he had been at home working late on some case files. He insisted that he had no knowledge that Carter was in any danger and expressed deep sorrow when he found out about his death. Despite his composed demeanor, Cawley noticed a slight shift in Brennan's behavior when they brought up the aconite found in Carter's tea. His face tensed, and his responses became more measured, as if he was weighing every word. Although Brennan remained outwardly calm, the detectives could feel a growing sense of unease in him, hinting that there might be more to his involvement than he was letting on. When asked if he had ever handled aconite or knew about its toxic effects, Brennan calmly replied that he was familiar with the plant, having come across it during a case years earlier. He was quick to insist, though, that he had never used it. Despite his composed response, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. Cawley and Keller sensed that Brennan might be holding back crucial information, deepening their suspicions. As the interview wrapped up, Cawley and Keller were left with lingering doubts. Brennan's ties to Carter and his familiarity with aconite made him a potential suspect, yet they lacked the hard evidence needed to move forward with an arrest. Still, his evasive behavior and the tension he exhibited during questioning only heightened their suspicions. It was clear to the detectives that Brennan remained a person of interest, and they weren't ready to cross him off their list just yet. On July 22, 2017, after weeks of relentless investigation, Richmond detectives Laura Cawley and Tom Keller finally identified the person responsible for Carter Dressler's death. The case had been fraught with twists, multiple suspects, and a web of conflicting evidence. However, the crucial details in Carter's letters, paired with the forensic findings, pointed them to one undeniable conclusion. The pieces had finally fallen into place, revealing the truth behind Carter's untimely demise. Dan White, Carter's 18-year-old student, neighbor, and secret lover, was identified as the murderer. Their relationship, which had been ongoing for over a year, started with mutual attraction and intense emotions. However, as time passed, it turned toxic, with Dan becoming increasingly possessive and controlling. The once consensual relationship spiraled into a dangerous obsession, ultimately leading to Carter's tragic death. Owens argued that Dan's obsession and jealousy were the motives behind the murder, portraying the poisoning as a final act of control and rage. She highlighted the premeditated nature of the crime. Dan's defense was handled by Desmond J. Carter, a 42-year-old attorney known for managing challenging cases. Carter's defense argued that Dan had not planned to kill Carter but was overwhelmed by emotional turmoil. They portrayed Dan as a troubled young man who acted out of a distorted sense of love, aiming to reduce his responsibility by framing his actions as the result of an emotional breakdown rather than premeditated murder. Throughout the trial, Carter's family sat in the front row, their faces a mix of grief and disbelief. They listened intently as the details of Carter's relationship with Dan were revealed. Emotions ran high as family members testified about the profound impact Carter's death had on their lives and the community. Their testimony portrayed Carter as a dedicated teacher who was deeply loved and respected. On August 15, 2017, after a week of intense arguments and emotional testimony, the jury reached a verdict. Dan White was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict brought a measure of relief to Carter's family, who had anxiously awaited this moment. At the sentencing on August 22, Dan White was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, taking into account the premeditated nature of the crime and the profound impact on Carter's family, deemed this sentence fitting. The courtroom was heavy with a somber satisfaction. While the sentence could not undo the tragedy or bring Carter back, it offered a sense of justice and closure to those he had left behind. The trial had deeply impacted the community, highlighting the far-reaching consequences of unchecked obsession and emotional turmoil. Richmond was rocked by the revelation of Carter's secret relationship and the subsequent murder. The community mourned the loss of a cherished figure while struggling to come to terms with the shocking nature of the crime. The case became a sobering reminder of how unchecked jealousy and obsession can lead to devastating consequences, leaving a lasting impact on those affected. Following Dan White's sentencing on August 22, 2017, the Richmond community began the difficult process of healing. The trial had deeply affected Carter Dressler's family, his students, and the broader community. As the community worked to recover, Dan White's life underwent a dramatic shift, with his future confined to a life sentence without parole. The repercussions of the case were felt far and wide, reshaping many lives and leaving a mark on the community's collective memory. Dan White was moved to a maximum security prison in Virginia, where he confronted a challenging reality. Although he was placed in protective custody due to the notoriety of his case, prison life proved to be harsh and unforgiving. The isolation and harsh conditions were a stark contrast to the life he once knew, and he struggled to adapt to his new environment. Dan's family faced significant challenges following the trial. His parents, who had been supportive during the legal proceedings, endured intense media and community scrutiny. To escape the constant attention and attempt to rebuild their lives, they decided to leave Richmond and relocate to a quieter area. In the years after the trial, Carter Dressler's case continued to resonate in Richmond. It remained a poignant reminder of the profound effects personal relationships can have and the tragic consequences of uncontrolled emotions. The community honored Carter's memory by celebrating the positive impact he had on those around him, ensuring that his legacy would be remembered with both reflection and respect.